There is a kind of silence that lives inside a flower shop just before morning fully arrives. A soft, breathable quiet where the smell of fresh petals and damp soil wraps around everything like a warm blanket. It was in this exact silence that Sora Miyamoto moved every single day, carefully trimming stems, arranging colors, and whispering small things to the flowers as if they could hear him and write back. He was 25 years old, and to anyone walking past the glass window of his little shop on Hanamachi Street, he looked like a young man who had figured out the simple secret to a peaceful life. His hands were always busy, his face was always soft, his eyes held the kind of steady warmth that made strangers feel, without knowing why, that everything was going to be fine. But Sora Miyamoto carried a weight that no flower arrangement could ever cover up. His father had died 2 years before the story begins, and the man had left behind not just memories and a well-loved shop, he'd left behind a debt. A large, serious debt that belonged to one of the most feared names in the entire city. The Akatsuki family did not run businesses the way regular people did. They moved through the world of the city like a current beneath still water, invisible to most, but powerful enough to pull anything under if they chose. For 2 years, Sora had been making small payments towards his father's debt, cutting costs wherever he could, eating simply, sleeping little, and telling no one about the quiet storm pressing against his chest every single morning when he opened the shop. He had a system, he had a plan. He was going to pay it all back on his own, slowly and honestly, the way his father would have wanted. Then, one afternoon, the front door of the flower shop opened, and the plan became something else entirely. Ren Akatsuki did not look like the stories people told about him. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that cost more than Sora's monthly rent, and he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made the air in a room feel different, heavier, more careful, like the air itself was paying attention. His face was sharp and clean, his eyes a deep gray that held no warmth and no apology. He was not cruel-looking, but he was not soft either. He was the kind of man who had decided a very long time ago that the world did not deserve his kindness, and had been proving that decision right ever since. He stood in the middle of the flower shop and looked around slowly, as if he were measuring the place for something, and then he looked at Sora. Sora looked back at him, set down his trimming scissors, and said very calmly, "I know who you are." Ren said, "Good, then we can skip the part where I introduce myself." The conversation that followed was not long and it was not warm. Ren laid out the facts the way a man places cards on a table, flat, deliberate, and without any interest in softening the landing. The debt was overdue. The original amount had grown. At the rate Sora was paying, it would take several more years to clear, and the Akatsuki family was not in the business of waiting that long. He could take the shop, he could take the apartment above the shop, he could take everything the Miyamoto name still had attached to it, and he had every legal and not-so-legal right to do exactly that. But then Ren said something Sora did not expect. He said he had a different offer. Ren needed a partner, not in the business sense, he had plenty of those. He needed a partner in the social sense, someone who would stand beside him at formal gatherings, important dinners, and the kind of events where powerful men sized each other up through polite conversation and expensive suits. He had been attending these events alone for years, and it had become a problem. Other families, other powerful groups were beginning to use his unmarried status as a pressure point, sending their own candidates, arranging situations, trying to tie him to alliances through relationship contracts he had no interest in. A partner, a husband, a person who clearly and publicly belonged beside him would close that door permanently. He needed someone calm, someone educated and presentable, someone who had no reason to want anything from him except the deal itself.
He looked at Sora across the quiet flower shop and said the debt would be canceled, fully and immediately, if Sora agreed to marry him. 1 year, No drama, no real expectations beyond public appearances and basic courtesy inside the house. After a year, they would separate quietly, and Sora would walk away free and unbothered. Sora was quiet for a long time. Ren watched him with those gray eyes and thought he already knew what the silence meant. He had learned a long time ago through painful and repeated lessons that people always said yes to him for one reason: what he could give them, his money, his protection, his name. He was not a man that people chose. He was a man that people used carefully and gratefully, and he had made his peace with that, or he told himself he had. So when Sora went quiet and looked down at the white flowers on the counter beside him, Ren simply waited, because he already knew what the answer would be, and he already knew exactly why Sora would give it. What Ren did not know, what he could not possibly have known standing in that flower shop with his dark coat and his certain eyes, was that Sora's silence had nothing to do with money. 3 weeks before that afternoon, Sora had sat in a small, clean office across from his doctor, a quiet man named Dr. Fujita, who had a habit of folding his hands on the desk before delivering news that was hard to carry. Dr. Fujita had folded his hands that day, and he had told Sora that the tiredness Sora had been feeling for months, the occasional dizziness, the way his body seemed to be working harder than it should to do ordinary things, was not just stress or poor sleep. It was something in his blood, something that was there, real and progressing, and that would need serious, expensive, long-term treatment to manage. It was not an immediate ending. It was not that simple or that dramatic, but it was serious, and it was going to get harder before it got easier, and Sora would need support and resources that a flower shop on Hanamachi Street could not easily provide. Sora thanked Dr. Fujita, walked home, made tea, sat by the window, and thought for a very long time. He had thought about calling someone, a friend, a distant relative, but every name that came to mind brought with it the image of that person's face changing, the soft horror, the weight of worry, the kind of love that turns into grief before anything has even happened. He could not give that to anyone. He had watched his father's illness do that to people. He had watched love curdle into exhaustion and helplessness, and he had decided somewhere deep and quiet inside himself that he would rather face whatever was coming on his terms, with his arms around it, than let it reach out and pull other people down with him. So when Ren Akatsuki walked into his shop and offered a contract, clean, honest, emotionless, temporary, Sora heard something that Ren did not intend to offer. He heard safety. Not the safety of money, though the canceled debt was a very real relief. He heard the safety of a situation where no one's heart was truly at risk. A business arrangement had walls around it. A business arrangement had an exit built right into the foundation. If Sora got worse, if the treatment became heavy, if the days became difficult, no one in this arrangement would be destroyed by loving him too much. Ren did not love him. Ren did not even know him. That felt to Sora in that moment like the kindest possible thing anyone had accidentally offered him. He said yes. Ren nodded once as if a small transaction had been confirmed and left the flower shop within the next 4 minutes. The wedding was small and quiet. There were no celebrations, no toasts, no family members crying happy tears in the front row. There was paperwork, a brief ceremony with 2 witnesses, Daichi on Ren's side and a neighbor from Hanamachi Street on Sora's, and then a car ride to the large, beautiful house on the hill where Ren Akatsuki lived behind tall walls and security that Sora would spend the first 3 days accidentally walking past without the correct access code memorized. The house was grand and very clean, with high ceilings and rooms that felt slightly too large for their furniture, as if the person living there had never quite decided how much of the space to actually use. Sora filled the empty corners with flowers. He brought them from the flower shop, which he kept running with the help of a part-time assistant he had been training for months. He put white flowers in the hallway and yellow ones in the kitchen, and something with deep purple blooms in the study near the window where the afternoon light came in at a good angle. The household staff watched him do this with expressions that ranged from surprised to quietly delighted. No one had ever brought flowers into this house before. No one had ever asked their names and remembered them the following morning, either. Ren noticed. He noticed everything, though he said nothing about any of it. He came home late most evenings, moved through the house like a man passing through a train station between connections, and exchanged with Sora only what was necessary: logistics, schedules, the occasional reminder about an event they needed to attend together. At those public events, Sora stood beside him beautifully. He was graceful and quiet, and said exactly the right things to exactly the right people. And when powerful men at dinner tables tried to measure him the way they measured everything else in Ren's world, Sora simply looked at them with those steady, warm eyes until they stopped. Ren found himself more than once watching Sora across a crowded room with an expression he did not have a name for. He told himself it was professional satisfaction. The arrangement was working, that was all. Then, one night, Ren came home later than usual. The house was dark except for the soft light coming through the glass door that led to the small balcony off the upper hallway. He was walking past when he saw Sora sitting there, knees pulled close, a small cluster of amber medicine bottles arranged on the railing beside him, like strange little soldiers.
Sora was not crying loudly. It was the quiet kind. The kind that happens when someone has learned that crying loudly does not make anyone come. So they have slowly stopped doing it that way. His shoulders moved slightly, and he was looking out at the night sky with an expression that Ren had never seen on his face before, because it was the one Sora never let anyone see. It was not peaceful. It was tired and a little afraid, and very, very alone. Ren's hand had risen to knock on the glass before he had consciously decided to do it. Sora spun around, saw him, and in the span of about 2 seconds performed a small and practiced miracle. The medicine bottles disappeared into the pocket of his cardigan. The tears were gone from his face, and that familiar soft smile settled into place as if it had never left. "I'm sorry," Sora said, opening the balcony door. "Did I disturb you?" Ren looked at him for a long moment and then looked at the railing where the bottles had been. He said, "What were those?" Sora tilted his head gently and said, "Nothing important, just vitamins. I keep forgetting to take them at the right time." And then, before Ren could push further, he added in a voice that was easy and light, "I was just watching the sky. I couldn't sleep. I'll go back inside now." He walked past Ren into the hallway, and Ren stood at the balcony door and watched him go, and did not say anything, because he did not know what to say. But the image of Sora's face, that unguarded, tired, frightened face before the smile had snapped back into place, stayed somewhere behind Ren's eyes for the rest of the night, and refused to leave even when he told it to. He lay in his room in the dark and thought about vitamin bottles arranged in a row like soldiers, and a man who cried so quietly the night itself almost didn't notice. And something in the deep, locked center of Ren Akatsuki's chest made a small, unfamiliar sound.
Time has a particular way of behaving when two people live together in an arrangement that was never supposed to feel like anything. It keeps moving forward anyway, indifferent to the rules they set, and it carries with it small moments that nobody planned for and nobody knows how to file away properly. Weeks passed inside the house on the hill, and Ren began to notice things. He noticed that every morning, without exception, there was a single fresh flower placed on the corner of his work desk before he sat down to start his day. It was never a dramatic arrangement, never anything that demanded attention or comment. Just one stem, always different, Some days white, some days deep orange, one memorable morning a pale pink one with a smell that followed him around the room for hours. He never saw Sora do it, he never heard him, but the flowers were always there, and Ren, who had never once in his adult life had anyone do something small and consistent and thoughtful for him without being asked or paid to do it, did not know what to do with that information. So he simply moved the flower to the side of the desk and started working, and thought about it at odd moments throughout the day when he should have been thinking about other things. He noticed that Sora never asked for things. This was the thing that confused Ren the most, because in his world everyone asked for things. His associates asked for favors, the people who reported to him asked for resources. The people who attended his events asked for his name attached to their causes. Even the people who worked in his house asked, reasonably and professionally, for what they needed. But Sora simply moved through the arrangement, taking up as little as possible, eating simple food, using the smallest guest room when he could have used any room in the house, turning off lights in rooms he left, as if he were a considerate guest in a hotel, and not a legal resident with every right to run up the electric bill. He spent his personal allowance from the arrangement on things Ren couldn't account for. The amounts were small and regular and consistent, and when Ren had Daiichi check the records out of habit, Daiichi came back with a report that said the withdrawals were always on the same dates, always the same modest amounts, always from the same part of the city near the hospital district, and always in cash. Daiichi said, in the careful voice he used when he was saying something Ren might not want to hear, "Sir, your husband visits a medical office regularly. I followed him once to confirm. He goes alone. He refuses the car. He walks." Ren looked at the report for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Don't follow him again," and closed the file, and Daiichi nodded and left, and Ren sat at his desk with the small orange flower in the corner and stared at the wall and breathed through something that was trying very hard to become something he didn't have a word for yet. That same week, Ren came home in the middle of the afternoon, an unusual thing caused by a canceled meeting, and found the house quiet except for soft movement in the garden. He walked through the back hallway and stood at the garden door and watched Sora on his knees in the dirt between the flower beds, hands deep in the soil, completely absorbed. There was a spot near the left wall of the garden where the garden had always been plain, just grass and a few old stones, and Sora had been transforming it slowly over the weeks into something layered and deliberate. Ren had registered the changes without really examining them. Now he stood in the doorway and looked properly, and he saw that the new garden section was a careful mix of colors and shapes that somehow felt like it had a voice. Red clusters near the back, bright yellow along the edges, and running along the front in a quiet line, a row of white flowers with delicate petals that moved slightly in the afternoon wind.
Ren walked out and sat down on the low stone border nearby. Sora looked up, and for once, the smile that came to his face was not the practiced, comfortable one. It was the surprised one, slightly unguarded, a little pleased, like when someone finds something they weren't expecting in a pocket. "You're home early," Sora said. "Meeting was canceled," Ren said, and looked at the flowers. "What are these?" So Sora explained them. He explained each section with the ease of someone who has known a subject for so long it simply lives in them, and Ren sat on the stone border and listened in a way that he did not often listen, without waiting to respond, without measuring what was being said for usefulness or relevance, just actually listening. The red ones meant deep feeling, the yellow ones meant cheerfulness and light. The white ones along the front, Sora said, in the same gentle tone he had used for all the others, meant farewell and remembrance. Ren looked at the white row and said, "Why would you plant those?" Sora brushed soil from his fingers and tilted his head at the flowers, as if he were considering the question on their behalf. Then he said, with a small and very steady smile, "Some things are worth remembering, even the endings." And before Ren could press it further, Sora pointed to a new section he was planning near the wall and asked what Ren thought about the colors,
And Ren, who had never had an opinion about garden colors in his life, found himself actually responding with one. They stayed in the garden for nearly 2 hours. Ren could not have explained afterward why he didn't go inside after 5 minutes the way he would have any other time. He only knew that something about sitting in the dirt and light next to a person who talked about flowers the way other people talked about old friends made the usual heavy pressure behind his ribs feel for a little while like it belonged somewhere else. It was the longest conversation they had ever had, and neither of them mentioned the contract once. That evening, over dinner, Ren said something he hadn't planned to say. He was looking at his plate when he said it, as if talking to the food were slightly easier than talking to the person across the table. He said, "My father left when I was 11. He had married into the family for the connections. When the connections stopped being useful, he found a different family to connect to. My mother explained it very simply. She said, people do not love each other, they love what each other can offer. When the offering stops, the love stops." He paused. I believed her. It seemed the only explanation that matched everything I kept watching happen. The table was quiet. Sora did not rush to fill the quiet with comfort or disagreement. He simply sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something that deserves not to be hurried past. Then he said, "The people who treated you that way were not careful with something important. That is their failing, not yours, and not something that gets to decide what is true about everyone forever." Ren looked up from his plate. Sora was looking at him calmly, without pity, without that particular soft horror that Ren had learned to brace for whenever he accidentally showed a crack to someone. Just looking at him, steady and sure, the way Sora looked at everything, as if the world were manageable if you just faced it without flinching. Ren did not know what to say, so he said nothing, but something in his chest that had been braced hard against the world since he was 11 years old shifted very slightly, a few degrees. Not enough to matter, he told himself, just enough that he noticed it. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ren did something he had not allowed himself to do before. He went to Sora's room. Sora was not there, had fallen asleep in the reading chair near the garden window, which Daichi had mentioned was becoming a habit, and he stood inside the quiet room and looked around. The room smelled of flowers, predictably. The small bookshelf held books about plants, and one very worn book of poems, and a handful of medical pamphlets that Sora had tucked at the far end as if to make them smaller by placing them last. Beside the books, on the nightstand, was a small dark journal with a pressed flower on the cover. Ren stood in the room for a long time, looking at the journal, telling himself clearly and firmly that it was not his to open. Then he opened it to the very first entry, and read only the first entry. It said, "Day 1 of the marriage. I thought this would feel empty and I would be relieved about that. But he looked at me in the flower shop today. Really looked, and I felt afraid. Please, please let me not fall in love with him. It will only hurt us both in the end. I cannot give someone like him more hurt. There is already so much I cannot change." Ren closed the journal. He put it back exactly where it had been. He left the room and walked down the hallway to the large window at the end and stood there for a long time, looking out at the city, at 10,000 lights that made up a place he had lived in his whole life and had never felt like his own. Please let me not fall in love with him. It will only hurt us both in the end. He read those words over and over inside his head until they stopped being words and became something else, a sound, low and uncomfortable, that settled behind his ribs beside the thing that had been growing there without permission for weeks. The next morning he came downstairs early for the first time in months and found Sora making tea in the kitchen with his back turned, humming something soft and tuneless. And Sora, hearing him come in, turned around with that warm smile, the real one, he noticed now, not the practiced one. The difference had become clear to him, and he couldn't unsee it. And said, "You're up early. Do you want tea?" And Ren sat down at the kitchen table and said yes, and watched the morning light come through the window and make small bright patches on the floor, and thought that he was in a very serious amount of trouble. 3 days later, Sora collapsed. It happened in the kitchen mid-morning. He had been reaching for something on the counter, and then he simply wasn't standing anymore, and the sound brought Ren from the study at a speed that he didn't know he was capable of, and he caught Sora before the floor did. And Sora was lighter than he should have been, and his face was the color of the white flowers in the garden, and his eyes when they opened were confused and blinking slowly, and Ren was on his knees on the kitchen floor holding him and feeling something very large and very cold moving through his chest. He said, in a voice that was quiet and rough and entirely unlike the voice he used for everything else, "Tell me the truth right now, please." And Sora looked up at him with those tired, half-open eyes, and for the first time since the flower shop, the practiced smile did not come.
There is a particular room in certain hospitals that is designed to be calming. Soft colors, low lights, the kind of quiet that is curated rather than natural. It is the room where doctors bring family members to hear things that need careful space around them. Dr. Fujita had used such a room many times in his career, and he had learned that the way a person sat in that room told you something true about them. Some people leaned forward with their elbows on the table. Some people sat very straight. Some people folded their arms and made themselves smaller. Ren Akatsuki sat in that chair with his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on Dr. Fujita with the concentrated attention of a man who had decided that understanding every single word was the most important thing he had ever done. Dr. Fujita told him everything. He explained that Sora had been living with this illness in his blood for over a year. He explained that it was serious and progressing, but that it was also treatable. Genuinely, meaningfully treatable with the right medical plan, the right support, consistent care, and resources that were beyond what Sora had been managing alone. He explained quietly and without drama that Sora had been doing exactly that, managing alone, paying for the most basic version of his care with small cash payments from what Dr. Fujita understood was a personal allowance, not telling anyone, not asking for any of the things that would have made this genuinely easier. Ren sat very still through all of it. When Dr. Fujita finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Ren said, "He used the allowance from our arrangement, the small monthly amount in the contract." Dr. Fujita said, carefully, "I believe so, yes. He was very private about his finances." Ren said nothing further. He thanked Dr. Fujita. He stood up and he walked out of that soft-colored room, and he stood in the hallway outside Sora's room, and he put one hand flat against the wall and he breathed. Daichi appeared beside him after a moment, as Daichi always did, present without being intrusive, there without needing to announce it. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor and did not say anything, because he had known Ren long enough to know that some moments needed to be stood next to rather than spoken into. What Daichi saw was something he had never seen in all the years he had known Ren Akatsuki, had never expected to see in the years that remained, had privately believed he might never see at all. He saw his boss, the man who had walked into rooms that terrified other men and walked out having changed the temperature of entire situations with nothing but composure, press his forehead briefly against the hallway wall and close his eyes. He did not make any sound. He did not shake, but there was one tear and then another, quiet and deliberate the way everything Ren Akatsuki did was quiet and deliberate, running down a face that was not composed for perhaps the first time in decades. Daichi reached over and put one hand on Ren's shoulder. That was all. Ren straightened after a moment. He looked at the ceiling and breathed once, long and slow. Then he said to Daichi, "I need you to make some calls," and his voice was steady, and Daichi nodded, and that was how the next chapter began. The calls Ren made were not small.
He contacted the best medical team in the city, then the second best, then a specialist that Dr. Fujita himself had only mentioned in passing as someone outside their usual reach. He cleared his schedule for the following week, then the week after. He had files gathered, research pulled, treatment options compared and laid out in front of him on his work desk, which had a fresh flower in the corner as it always did, and he read every single page of them the way he read important contracts, with complete attention, marking things to clarify, building his understanding from the ground up. He was not a medical man. He knew nothing about this illness except what had been told him and what he was now teaching himself as quickly and thoroughly as he could. But he was a man who understood that the best way to protect something was to understand it completely, and Sora had become something he wanted to protect with every resource he had ever built.
When Sora was awake and settled, Ren came into the room with a folder and a very serious expression and sat down in the chair beside the bed and said, "I've arranged a medical team. Your treatment will be handled completely and properly starting this week. You will not be managing this alone anymore." Sora stared at him. The response that came was not gratitude, it was fear. Immediate, visible, unguarded fear. The kind that only shows up when someone realizes the wall they built has just been looked over. Sora's hand reached across the blanket and closed around Ren's wrist, and his eyes were wide, and his voice was tight when he said, "Ren, you don't have to do this. The contract does not include this. I didn't marry you expecting this. This isn't what the agreement was." Ren looked at the hand on his wrist. Then he looked at Sora's face, this face that had been managing everything alone for over a year, this face that built a whole careful situation around not letting anyone love him too closely, this face that grew white flowers in a garden and wrote in journals by lamplight and cried quietly on balconies and chose loneliness over the thought of pulling someone else into pain. He said, in the quietest voice he had spoken in a very long time, "Forget the contract. I am not here as your business partner." Sora's breath caught. They looked at each other for a long moment, and the room was very still, and all the careful architecture that Sora had built around himself, the easy smile, the practiced calm, the generous distance, was not there anymore. It was just him, tired and pale and a little afraid, and Ren sitting beside the bed with the folder in one hand and Sora's hand around his other wrist, not moving away. Sora said, in a voice that was barely held together, "I didn't want anyone to be broken by this. That was the whole reason. I thought if the situation had clear edges, real and concrete edges, then when things got hard, there would be a clean line between us, and neither of us would—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the window. Ren said, "You thought if you kept me at the right distance, I couldn't get hurt when things got harder." Sora didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Ren said, "You made that decision before you knew me and before I knew you. You decided I was someone who needed to be protected from the possibility of caring about you." He paused, and his voice stayed level, but something behind it was not level at all. "You were afraid I would get hurt if I ended up loving you, but you never once stopped to consider that I might want to make that choice for myself." The silence that came after that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists when something true has just been said and the air needs a moment to adjust to it. Sora's eyes filled. He was not hiding it this time. The tears ran down and he let them, and he held Ren's wrist and said very quietly, "I started falling for you in the garden, when you sat down on the stones and actually listened. I fought it as hard as I've ever fought anything. I kept telling myself it would be wrong to let it happen, that loving you while keeping this secret was a kind of dishonesty, and letting you love me while knowing how uncertain everything was would be a cruelty." Ren turned his hand over so that his palm was up and Sora's fingers rested in it, and Ren closed his hand gently around them. He said, "You are not a burden. You are not a situation to be managed. You are not something I accidentally got close to that I need protection from." He looked at Sora with the most open expression Sora had ever seen on that careful, guarded face, the face that had been built over decades to show nothing, now showing something, fully and without apology. You are the person who put flowers on my desk every morning without asking for a single thing in return. You are the person who remembered every staff member's name in a week. You are the person who sat in my garden and explained to me what things mean when nobody else ever bothered. I do not need to be protected from any of that. I need more of it. I needed it before I knew I needed it. Sora laughed, which surprised them both, a short, wet, real laugh that came out between the tears, the kind that happens when something is both very sad and very relieving at the same time. He pulled their joined hands against his chest and looked at the ceiling and breathed, and Ren sat beside him and did not move away. The months that followed were not the smooth and golden kind that stories sometimes rush toward. Recovery is not smooth. Treatment is not golden. There were days when the medical plan worked beautifully, and Sora's energy came back in small, bright returns, and they sat in the garden together in the late afternoon, like two ordinary people with nowhere urgent to be. And there were days when the treatment made Sora too exhausted to stand, and Ren rearranged his entire day around a changed plan without mentioning it, and sat in the hallway outside the room with his work files spread across the floor so he could be close without being intrusive.
There were days when Ren's old habits crept back. The cold voice when he was stressed, the closed-off expression when something pressed too hard on his chest, the retreating into work as a form of armor. But every time that happened, he would catch himself. He would think about white flowers and what they meant. He would walk back to wherever Sora was and say, without a large speech, something small and direct and true. And Sora would look at him with those warm eyes and say something small and direct and true back, and the wall would go back down. Ren learned to be present in ways he had never been taught. Sora learned to ask for things, slowly, unpracticed and unsure of himself at first, but learning. They argued sometimes, quietly, and then with more honesty, and discovered that arguing with someone who respects you is entirely different from any kind of conflict Ren had known before. It ended with both people sitting on the same side of the table, which was new. The doctors were hopeful. The treatment was working. Dr. Fujita said, at a check-in 3 months later, that Sora's numbers were moving in the right direction, and that with continued care, the picture looked genuinely better than it had a year ago before any of this had begun. On a Sunday afternoon, soft with late light and the smell of the garden coming through the open back door, Ren sat beside Sora on the low stone border where they had first talked about flowers. The garden had grown since then, fuller, more layered, deeply itself. The white flowers along the front edge were gone. Sora had replaced them weeks ago with deep red ones that moved slowly in the afternoon air like they were listening to something pleasant. Ren reached into his pocket and took out a ring, not the formal one from the contract ceremony. That one had been chosen by an assistant in 10 minutes for the sake of appearances. This one Ren had spent 2 weeks choosing with the same deliberate energy he gave everything that actually mattered to him. It was simple and specific and exactly right, and he placed it in Sora's palm and folded Sora's fingers over it. Sora opened his hand and looked at it for a long moment. He said in a voice that was very careful and a little unsteady, "Is this still a contract?" Ren looked at the red flowers. He thought about a flower shop on a street where morning was always quiet, and a pair of trimming scissors set down on a counter, and a young man who said, "I know who you are," with complete calm, and a garden explained with love, and a journal entry read by lamplight that had cracked open something that had been closed for 20 years. He said, "Red means love. You taught me that." Sora made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a breath and a laugh, full and real, with all of itself in it, not held back at all. He put the ring on his own finger and looked at it there, and the late afternoon light made it warm, and the garden moved gently around them. Ren looked at him. For a man who had spent every year of his adult life believing that love was a transaction and people were their usefulness to each other, that sound, that simple, whole, unguarded laugh was worth more than anything else he had ever collected in his life. He had not known before Sora that a person could want something so much without knowing what it was. He had not known that what he had always been missing was not power or security or the absence of betrayal, but this, just this, someone who brought flowers without being asked, someone who sat in the dirt and explained what things meant, someone who was brave enough to be afraid and honest enough eventually to say so. He had thought Sora married him for money. He had been wrong about that, and he had been wrong about most of the other things he had taught himself to believe, and being wrong had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to him. The garden was full of red. The afternoon held, and Ren Akatsuki, the ruthless Mafia alpha who had spent a lifetime building walls thick enough to keep the whole world out, sat in the dirt beside the only person who had simply walked around the wall and waited on the other side, and stayed there, completely, without needing to be asked twice. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself rooting for Ren to soften, or holding your breath for Sora to finally be seen, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never just about a mafia boss, or an illness, or a contract. It was about what happens when two people who have both decided for very different reasons that they are not allowed to be loved finally meet someone who refuses to agree with that decision. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and share it with someone who loves a good emotional romance. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the garden scene, the journal entry, or the red flowers? Subscribe so you never miss the next story. New anime romance narrations are posted regularly, and each one is made with the same care that Sora gave each flower arrangement, with intention, with feeling, and with you in mind. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That means everything. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and let the people who love you, love you.